So you wanted to upgrade your PC CPU, but the numbers on CPUs and generation names of CPUs are really confusing and you're not sure what to go for. Well, hopefully this video should clear those things up for you. Okay, I'm going to keep this really sort of short and sweet and simple because there are that many CPUs out there to choose from. So today on this video we're going to focus on one mainstream company in particular. We're going to focus on AMD, as most people coming back to the PC scene or are new to the PC scene, whether it's buying their own parts to build or if they are, example, buying a pre-built, most PCs will come with an AMD CPU or Intel, but we'll cover Intel on another video, but today we're going to basically focus on AMD. Now, there's quite a lot of things to take in when it comes to buying a CPU. You've got AMD Athlon CPUs, and then you have the more popular Ryzen series of CPUs. So we'll cover the Ryzen series of CPUs because they're the more profound number you're going to find in a PC. You will on times, if you buy a pre-built, come across an AMD Athlon, but they're pretty much really sort of low budget. So we're going to go for the low budget to high end of AMD's CPUs and cover what the numbers mean and what the generations actually mean. So let's start with the numbers. AMD's Ryzen series of CPUs start with a Ryzen 3 up to a Ryzen 5, 7 and top end Ryzen 9, and then for the really high end and enthusiast level of CPUs they have their Threadripper series. Now let's pick I don't know, let's go for a Ryzen 5. Let's go for a sort of mid-range CPU, Ryzen 5. So we'll go for, say, a Ryzen 5 2600X. The number 5 indicates the actual name and number of that CPU. It's a Ryzen 5. It's the second in the family of Ryzen numbered CPUs. So 1 as again, 3, 5, 7 and 9. Now if you're looking at the CPU itself with 2600X, the first digit in that line of numbers indicates the generational mark, number 2, meaning it's a second generation Ryzen 5. If it was a first generation Ryzen 5 it will be 1600X. Third generation 3600X and above. The 00 at the end of that is basically the SKU number. It's like a, I wouldn't say marketing, it's more of a retailing sort of detail to code what position that CPU is in. Excuse me. Okay, yeah. So it's the second generation Ryzen 5. It's the same with Ryzen 7s, 3600, 5600. You know, the first number actually denotes what that CPU actually is, what generation that falls into, which makes it a lot easier to understand when you're looking to upgrade your CPU. Do you go for a first generation, second generation or third generation? Architecture of AMD CPUs, which to be fair, makes it so much easier, because if you're wanting a more budget friendly CPU but you want better speed, better processing, more cores, more threads and more processing power, you could probably go for a second generation or an even third generation Ryzen 5. It's still a Ryzen 5, it just means the further the generation up it is, the faster it is, and the thickness of the actual CPU is actually changed from 14 nanometers down to 7 nanometers, which probably won't make any difference to us if you're just upgrading your CPU, but that's just the thickness of the CPU itself. So you've got 14 nanometer and then 7. It's just the thickness of the SKU. Now this is where things really come into their own now. You're wanting to change your CPU but you're not sure what you have already. So to make things clearer, AMD uses socket AM4, which, to be honest, the AM4 socket has been around for quite a while and makes things so much easier when upgrading CPU than it is compared to Intel, whereas if you wanted to upgrade your Intel CPU you would have to change your motherboard as well, because the fitment is completely different. But with AMD, the fitment stays the same. It's still an AM4 socket. If you want to buy, say if you already have a AMD AM4 motherboard, which for example is a A320M, which is the sort of budget level of motherboards, and you wanted to go all the way up to say around a B550, shall we say, a B550, which is sort of like not exactly the top end, but it's as far as it can go, and you still have a Ryzen 5 3600, you can still pop out that CPU and put that into a B550, but you may need to do a firmware update on your motherboard BIOS to make sure that your CPU is compatible with that motherboard. But with it being socket AM4, it will fit. There's no messing around. You don't have to change your motherboards, you don't have to change anything. For me, from my example, I bought my PC as a pre-built, which had a AMD Athlon APU in there. We'll cover that in a second, what an APU is. But I upgraded my A320M to a B450, and it was a simple case of popping out the CPU and then popping it into the B450. No messing around, no changing motherboards, a simple swap in CPU. It's so much easier with AMD. You have quite a lot to offer with AMD motherboards because we're all using the AM4 socket. Now unfortunately, if you are wanting to change your Intel CPU, you're more than likely, but to be fair, you are going to have to change your motherboard as well, because the compatibility issues aren't there. You have to change both with Intel, unlike what you have to do with AMD. It's just change your CPU, and maybe on later down the line change your motherboard. Now time for a coffee, as it is still early. It's the only time I can get these videos done. That's better. Now, as I mentioned before, with the AMD Athlon, it was an APU, which it's still an AMD CPU. It still has the AM4 socket. What it generally means is it's got integrated graphics inside the chip. So if you don't have that much money and you don't really want to spend so much on a separate graphics card, you can buy an AMD CPU with graphics processing power already built into the chip. It's usually using Radeon graphics chip, but if you're not too sure if it has integrated graphics or not, just look at the end of the SKU for the CPU. It usually denotes a G at the end of that SKU. So for the old AMD Athlon was a 200G, which means with the G it has integrated graphics. Now you can, for example, buy that chip with integrated graphics and upgrade to a separate graphics card in the future. Just need to fiddle around with a few settings, and more often than not, once you plug in your monitors to your graphics card, the BIOS and the PC should recognise that, and then all you have to do is just download the drivers, which makes things so much easier whether you go with an AMD card or an NVIDIA card. It's just, you just need to pop it in, download the software, and you're pretty good to go. Even if you have an AMD CPU with integrated graphics still, you'll just be using the graphics card and you won't be using the onboard graphics port on the back of your motherboard. And even to make things even simpler, if you're browsing online, or I would say if you're going out to a PC specialist shop, but given COVID, you're not going to get there. Most AMD boxes, whether it be Ryzen or Athlon, generally tend to come with it's either greyed out or a silver strip at the top of the box. That usually denotes, it even says it on the box as well, on the strip itself, with integrated graphics. And if you want to go for a Ryzen 5 with integrated graphics, you'll usually have a G, and if you're not too sure on that, and the product item description doesn't have that, and it shows a silver strip on top of the box, it will have integrated graphics. It's just an easy way of having a glance at it. You're thinking, right, I want to get a Ryzen 5, but I don't have a dedicated graphics card. You can look at that, you can look at the serial number, even look at the picture, because that will tell you whether or not it comes with integrated graphics. And to be fair, integrated graphics CPUs aren't that bad. They generally seem to run slower than most mainstream CPUs that don't have integrated graphics, because you're sort of splitting that power between the CPU and the graphics part of that CPU. If you go in for a dedicated GPU, graphics card, then you'll probably utilize more CPU power than you would do without using the integrated graphics. So if you're not really interested in clock speeds, the sort of top end boost clock speed, can it be overclocked, then that is basically what you can look at. Look at the generation number, which is the first number after the CPU's number, and then just look at the end of the actual 00 skew. If it's got an X, it's generally sort of it's got more power than one without an X. If it's a 3600G, it's got integrated graphics. If it's a 3600X, it's a 3rd gen Ryzen 5 with just a little bit more boost power, a bit more megahertz. It's still a Ryzen 5, it just has a bit more oomph to it. But without going into too much detail, that is mainly the basics of what you can expect and what to look for if you wanted to upgrade your AMD CPU. You'll spill my coffee then. Without sort of baffling you with the numbers for clock speeds, for megahertz, for boost clock, if you just want excuse me, if you're just wanting to know what CPU to buy, what generation it is it better than X CPU versus Y CPU, you can always go, I mean you can always go on Google or go online and just compare the two. Even if you go on Amazon, if you pick one Ryzen 5 with generation 2 and another Ryzen 5 with generation 3, you can usually compare the two, and it will denote just how much better the newer generation is to the previous, whether it be thickness of the die, is it 14 nanometers, is it 7 nanometers, what boost clock speed is it a higher frequency clock speed compared to the lower clock speed, how many cores it's got, how many threads it's got. Generally, the more cores and threads you have on a CPU, the better performance you're going to get. So you can go for 8 cores, 16 threads, or you can go for 2 cores, 4 threads, and so on. It's generally multiplied by how many you've got. So 2 cores, 4 threads. It does take a bit of getting used to if you're new to high-end PCs, or if you're new to PCs, or even if you're coming back from PCs from having quite a bit of a lengthy break off and you're not really sure what's going on, like I was. You're thinking, well, they're all Ryzen 5, but why have they all got different numbers? Isn't it the same CPU? In a nutshell, yes, it's still a Ryzen 5. It's just got better with age. Think of it as, I don't know, a cask whiskey. The further on it gets, the better it gets. And that's the thing with CPUs. The higher the numbers, the better it will be. Now, if you're not bothered about numbers and you just want to upgrade your CPU, always make sure you're buying the same CPU for your motherboard that you currently own. You cannot put an AMD CPU on an Intel board and vice versa. They simply just don't fit. It will not happen, and if you try, you're gonna have a bad day. So if you're gonna upgrade, always check first what CPU you've got, because the rule is, if you've got an AM4 motherboard, you're only going to be able to use AMD chips, whether it's AMD Athlon right up to the Ryzen 9. You cannot put a Ryzen Threadripper on your board. That is a completely different socket and a completely different CPU. AMD's Threadripper is a massive monster of a CPU chip, and if you're just using it for mainstream and web browsing, you're not going to need it. So just bear that in mind. If you've got an Intel board, you can only use an Intel chip. If you've got an AMD board with socket AM4, not the previous generation's AM3 socket, has to be AM4. And most manufacturers and retailers, whether it's Amazon, eBay, PC World, or wherever you are, will denote on that motherboard socket AM4. And if you see that, you're pretty much fine to use anything from the beginning entry-level AM4 CPUs right up to a Ryzen 9 CPU on an AM4 socket. But the further up your motherboard goes, and you've got an older generation CPU, most motherboards are already coded to use the older style of motherboard. However, if you've just bought yourself a brand new B550 board and you're using current gen Ryzen 9 and you wanted to use the new 5000 CPUs, you will have to go online and download you'll have to go online and download your latest BIOS version for your BIOS, so it is able to run a newer generation CPU. Most boards sold now are compatible with anything from 1st gen right up to 3rd gen and 4th gen, needing a BIOS update. And that's pretty much how they work. I know I've waffled on a bit much, but if that's the only information you really need to know about if you wanted to upgrade a CPU. Look at the numbers, compare the generation numbers compared to the one you wanted to buy, and just do a comparison between every range of AMD CPU you wanted to buy. It just makes life so much easier if you know what numbers mean what and what generation means what, so you don't trip over your own feet, so to speak. Oh. And apologies if I do sound relatively bunged up. It's coming down with a cold. It's that time of year. Usually around about this time of year I start coming down cold, which is not good, because when I get cold my nose goes and yeah, I can't breathe. So I start sounding husky and like I need to download some kind of meditation software to relax myself and try and get rid of the cold. But that is enough of all this chitter chatter and enough about me coming down with cold. Will you stop going off? Are you going to do it? Yeah, thank you. But that is, in a nutshell, basically what you need to look for if you wanted to upgrade your AMD chip. Just look for the number, look for the generation number, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know what generation it is. Just by looking at them numbers, you can go, ooh, that's 3rd gen, it's better than that one. Yeah, it's not as good as that one, but it's in the middle and it's what I can do with. It's got plenty of power that I need. It's going to be a decent CPU that I need to do desktop work, web browsing, even video editing and streaming. You're going to be better off with a mid-level to, not say a high-end, but a top-ender CPU, because most low-end CPUs you would probably struggle with doing certain content creation, whether it's rendering videos or streaming, because it hasn't got that much power to process everything from rendering a video to streaming on YouTube or streaming on Twitch or whatever platform you decide to stream on. We'll cover that in another video, but that is basically what it is to look for an AMD chip. It's essentially the same as looking at Intel, but we'll cover Intel on a completely different video, because I don't want to confuse you by using AMD and Intel in the same video. It could get rather confusing, and that's what this video is not about, trying to confuse you further. It's trying to make things easier rather than throw all the technical specifications right at it and go, right, okay, this does this, that does that, it's got this many cores, that many threads, clock speed is this, but you can overclock it to this, it's got a maximum boost of this. You don't need that right now. The basics of upgrading a CPU is just look at the numbers and decide whether it's right for you. The whole process of this channel is to not baffle the new PC user with numbers and SKUs and clock speeds and hyper-threading. They don't want that. They just want to know, can I use it, and is it going to be powerful enough for what I need? And that's it. Well, I hope this video has made things a bit easy for you. I know I've rambled on a bit too much of what I really needed to do, but if I'd have just gone through the basics with you, it would be a very short video. So I wanted to try and fill it out a bit, just to give you a bit of a guide on what to do with your CPU, what you can put it in, how to use your motherboard, and if you need to do a firmware upgrade. But out of the box, with a B450 and, for example, a Ryzen 3 or a Ryzen 5 2nd or 3rd gen, you're going to be fine. If you're still unsure, there's tons of videos online, and you can also go on Overclockers UK, PC Master Race. There's plenty of forums out there which you can join up and to discuss, you know, where I'm new to PCs, what do I do? Because back when I got my first PC, which was 1999, we didn't have all this high-end graphics cards and RGB and water cooling and everything else that's thrown into it. It was basically a box with bits slammed under your desk. That could be as something for a future video. Stay tuned. That might happen. But yeah, for the next video it will be pretty much the same as this one, but instead of covering AMD we'll be covering Intel, which has proven itself to be quite a stable competitor with AMD. It used to be the other way around. Now Intel is competing with AMD. Intel have been around for years, and there's going to be a lot more to cover in that, but I don't want to go down the entire history route of Intel and AMD from their first CPUs right up to the present day, because again, that's scope for another video. Excuse me. But from this video, and I think I've covered everything I need to do on AMD CPUs right down to the basics, not to confuse the user, I think I shall call it there. And I hope that this video has made it easy for you to make a change for your CPU and made it easier for you to decide on what to buy. Next video will be pretty much the same, but covering Intel, so stay tuned for that. But from me and this, take care, bye for now.